Okay, so one of the other questions that I get asked a lot is, can helicopters land on a roof of a building? Because we see, you see it on the movies, you see it in somewhere, and you say, can you land on a building? And so, well, I land on buildings all the time, but these are helipads that are on top of buildings, or on top of skyscrapers, or on top of hospital buildings, that kind of thing, right? But these are purpose-built helipads. So the helipad, the landing pad, has been structured to withstand the weight of the helicopter. On all helipads, you'll have a number. It could be 12.5, it could be 15.7, and it'll say T right next to it. And that basically means the tons, the maximum weight that this helicopter or this helipad can withstand. So it can take small to medium sized helicopters, but it can't take large helicopters, for example, right? So every helicopter has been stress tested, it's been designed to take a certain thing. And then as an operator, as a helicopter pilot, and certainly in a commercial sense, we would go and survey these sites, these helipads, rooftop pads, to look at, well, what are the obstructions in the area? What is the best way to approach and land on here in accordance with how the helicopter is supposed to be flown when landing on these kinds of structures, these kinds of helipads on top of buildings, let's say. So we would work out the performance, we work out any kind of obstacles, we work out what is the best direction in and out of to take off and to land on these helipads. So those are structures that are designed to take the weight of the helicopter. So can the helicopter land on building roofs? Yes, if the helipad is already been designed. Now, the next question is, can they land on any roof? Right. So if a roof is flat, and I'm talking any roof here, if a roof is flat, then yes, a helicopter could attempt to land on it because there are no obstructions that would hit the blades, and there'd be physically the helicopter be able to land on that roof of a building. But you have no way of knowing whether that roof will be able to withstand the weight of the helicopter. So therefore, guess what the answer is? No, you can't land on any kind of roof. It's got to have to be a flat roof, right? You can't land on a pitched roof, or certainly land. You might be able to hover or lightly put your skids down, whatever. But in terms of getting like police or your special forces or whatever to jump out the helicopter, and this is why in those kind of those tactical situations where a helicopter will hover above that building, and they'll abseil, they'll fast rope out of the helicopter either onto the building or whatever. So on an untested building roof, a flat roof, the helicopters won't land on it. Now the question is, should helicopters be able to land on these buildings? So it's my contention, my argument is this: especially it's harder to retrofit buildings with helicopter pads because there's a lot of expense there, right? And possibly a lot of unnecessary expenses. But I'm specifically talking about in cities, right? And depends on where you go in the world. So different cities have a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of big buildings will have helicopter pads, but many don't. So let's say in London, very few. The hospitals have them, only a few, but very few buildings that have helicopters pads or landing areas on them. So it's my contention is this, especially for the emergency services. Any new building that has been constructed, any skyscraper, any taller building, must have a helipad landing area. And it doesn't mean that it's a commercial landing area that any helicopter can land. It's a landing area just for emergency helicopters, let's say police or helicopters, so that you can deliver a patient or pick up a patient from the roof of that building. Or it's a building where you can land on, and it's very near or just around the corner from another another incident where you can go to. Now, these are only to be used, let's say, unless you can't find a nearby park or something like that where you can land in. So that's a problem with built-up areas, in that it's the ability to land the helicopter, whether it's a commercial sense or whether it's in an emergency services response. So for my money, if you go over any new buildings, or if there's a will to put structures on lots of buildings, or lots of buildings, and where you can land a helicopter safely, then that would be great. That would be great for the aviation industry. That would be great for everybody. But certainly new buildings say, well, there's got to be an emergency response here for this building, and part of that response is to get people off that building, off that helipad, onto and away, and the helicopter can land on it. Now, the other question here is to say, well, what about if a helipad or a building roof has not been tested, but you could land on it? In terms of it's big enough, it's flat enough, there are no restrictions, there are no vents coming out of it, that kind of thing. Well, again, you just don't know. But then you'd face two issues. One, of a legal issue of landing on a roof that isn't certified, but also endangering other people unnecessarily. Let's just say if something did go wrong, so there are lots of different issues. And also possibly, well, you might be able to land on a roof, but there might not be any access off the roof, for your crew or your people to get on and off the helicopter as well. So you kind of be landing on the roof for no reason, really. And if you do cause damage, there's going to be obviously repercussions as well. Now, I'm not talking about in a non-emergency situation, right? Because if it's an emergency situation, then you might be able to land on the roof, for example. But most cases, 99.9% of the cases, you're not going to be able to land on any roof that isn't already structured for it to take the weight of a helicopter and designed to take a helicopter its landing. So in other words, it's got to have a helipad already designed on there. Now, the landing limit on these helipads will be designed in its structure. How heavy the weight of the helicopter must be, or the maximum weight of the helicopter can be. How to access onto the pad. What's the fire suppression? What firefighting issues? Let's say if there is an emergency, you have a fire, you have a crash on the helipad. What is the emergency plan? All that kind of stuff. So there's lots of different things to consider. And also, as I say, commercial operator will look at the best way to land on the helicopter, on the helipad, and the best way to take off, what kind of approach, what kind of departure we would do, that kind of thing. But can a helicopter land on building roofs? Yes, they can. It depends, but in all situations there has to be a flat surface for which the helicopter to land on, and it's got to be an approved surface. It's got to be approved helipad, because if it isn't, then there's always a risk that the helicopter is going to just crash through. The weight of the roof won't be designed to take the weight of the helicopter, or the structure of the roof won't be designed to take the weight of the helicopter, and you'll cause damage, and you'll probably even fall through the roof of it as well. Now, there's another structure where you could think of, what about a multi-story car park? Well, a multi-story car park, and you can say, right, okay, I've got various multi-story car parks in the operating area. So if there's an emergency situation, in terms of we're responding to an emergency situation on one of the levels of the multi-story car park, and we can land on the top of the multi-story car park, then there's a potential that you can do, right? And you don't really know if it will be a last resort to land on top of a multi-story car park, but you potentially could do it. The problem is that there are going to be so many cars there, so you might not have a clear enough area. And also, most of these multi-story car parks have little lampposts all over the place. So the chance of being able to land there in a wide enough area, a big enough area, to meet the minimum landing requirements of the helicopter is really quite, it's in doubt. And then always comes into the question would be asked, well, how can you guarantee that the structure of the multi-story car park can take the weight of the helicopter, and you can't say legitimately, oh yes you can. No, you can pretty rationalise as though it's a multi-story car park, it's made of concrete, reinforced concrete, it carries the weight of hundreds and hundreds of cars. I think it can take the weight of a helicopter, right? And most people would not disagree, but there'll be all these kinds of questions. But actually the limiting factor to land on the top deck of a multi-story car park will be not the structure of the multi-story car park itself, whether it can take the helicopter. The biggest thing would be all these little lampposts all over the place, or wires going across the top of it, or structural cabling that might be over the top of it, or lots of people walking around, or lots of cars walking around. I mean, there are certain situations, let's say different times of the day or different times of the year, where the car park might be deserted, so you might be able to land there, but it's not always possible. It's not always possible to do that. So yes, landing helicopters on top of roofs can be done if it's been structured to do so, if it's an approved helipad. But unless it's not, then you're either going to have to hover above, or you'll probably do some damage to the helicopter, so you're not going to be able to do it, of course. Now, okay, there is another example here where we're talking about emergency situations. So there was, we hark back to people stranded on a roof, fires, this kind of thing. Grenfell fires here in the UK. You had obviously the Twin Towers in the US, that kind of thing. Could you feasibly, if we set aside all the smoke and the fire and the flames and all that kind of stuff, right, feasibly quickly go up on top of the helicopter, on top of the roof, land a helicopter on top of the roof, get as many people off as you can? Yes, you could, but again, we're talking about emergency scenario here. And also it's a real problem, because you're having to deal with the panic of the people, and then also you could easily damage the helicopter. People could injure themselves, whatever, just trying to scramble and surge towards the helicopter. So it isn't ideal. If you've only got one or two people on the roof, let's say, then potentially you could go and land on the roof, or very light skid on the roof, so you're not actually putting pressure on the structure. But then you'd have to have a very well-briefed crew. Say one crew comes up with you, you quickly go up, you scramble a couple of people on, you take off, you just drop down to a nearby park, they get off, you go back up, that kind of thing. But it's not going to be an easy thing. There are so many dangers with doing that. But it won't necessarily mean that the helicopter will get damaged, or the structure of the roof won't be able to take the helicopter. It's just that it's not designed for it. And an emergency situation, and also if you've got flames coming up at the side of a building, that's not the place for a helicopter either. So it's going to be very, very difficult. It'll be very, very difficult. And unless you go to the other side of the building where there's nothing, and you can get people to come over to your side, there's always thoughts that go through the back of your mind. But say if I've always said this, especially the way it works in the UK in terms of responding to emergency scenarios, and even if you saved 10 lives, I think you'd be hailed as a hero in terms of a pilot. But the same day, I think the authorities would probably take your license away from you. That's the problem with that scenario, with landing on a roof to rescue people. Because now, especially in terms of emergency services, because we have certain rules to follow. But I think you would, if there's an opportunity to go and do something like that, then I think it would be hard. It would be hard one not to attempt to do it. But I think the fallout would be absolutely insane. The fallout would be insane on your career as well. That's the unfortunate thing.